Hello, everyone. It's been great to be here. I'm Heng Wang. It's been fantastic to join this conference. At the very beginning, I would like to thank Connie and James for the kind invitation. What I would like to talk today is about the breadth, depth, and strengths of the Australia-India trade agreement. And at the very beginning, I would like to give a very brief introduction and then explore the two majors of free trade agreements. And I will continue to explore a framework covering the rules coverage, which is what we call breadth, essence, which I use the criteria of the depth, and implementation, which I would like to describe it as a factor of the strength to help understand what is the trade agreements and which can be applied to the Australia-India trade agreements analysis. And also, here's one article of mine which relates to this framework, which you can download by scanning the QR. Now, as we know that India is a major trading partner of Australia, and also it's been very important given the India is a major economy and also a major part of Australia. And we look forward to see emerging of the CECA, the Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Agreements. The plan is that they will have interim agreements in liberalizing trade in goods and services and followed by negotiation to conclude these agreements. And since we have a limited at this stage information about say these trade agreements, but we can have a broader picture of the free trade agreements, which can help us understand the landscape. I would like to see that it's interesting to see whether the India-Australia trade agreements will be how they be either will they be a deep free trade agreements or it's be a relatively shallow free trade agreements. And if we look at the broader picture, we're able to see that there are deep free trade agreements like this CPTPP or CETA between Canada and the EU. Those kind of deep free trade agreements take an approach of regulatory, what I call plowing, which means that they set new standards in new areas, and also often address differences in regulatory sphere, and also try to regulate trade beyond the rules of WTO and the subject many obligations to law enforcement. They try to address the coordination externalities like the multiplicity of national policy and measures. On the other hand, it constrains the regulatory attitudes and explain maybe reason why deep FTAs also get criticism. Another side of the story is that we also have many free trade agreements. For example, those are concluded by China, which are largely follow the WTO rules. They take account of the approach, which is like early harvest one, which means focus more on market access commitments and try to address some of the trade barriers, internalize externalities. But these agreements lack detailed regulatory disciplines, particularly those beyond existing WTO rules. If we look at, say, now I'd like to look into what are the potential framework, if we look at those different categories of trade agreements, either deep one or early harvest one. I think there may have three major aspects or dimension we can look into that. One is the breadth. So we should look into, the outreach or even account of the coverage of these trade agreements. There are two major indicators, I think. One is whether they have a WTO plus rules, whether they, for example, we usually look into two major, WTO plus rules like behind the border measures, whether they have detailed rules on that, go beyond WTO criteria, or they have, good governance type requirements. They may have some overlap, but, with you are able to see many behind the border measures like those on financial services, telecommunications. For good governance one, you are able to see for example requirements for enhanced transparency, and also another indicator for the breadth is to look at to WTO beyond rules, which go, outside the WTO scope. There could be rules on state-owned enterprises, competition, currency, anti-corruption, social matters. And we already see the deep FTAs, which try to reduce or harmonize non-tariff measures in those kind of areas and integrate good governance rules. But for India and Australia trade agreements, it's remain to be seen whether they will, focus more on traditional trading goods and services than other areas. We know that they will have discussion about energy, resources, logistics, standards, origin rules, SPS measures, but it remains to be seen whether, to what extent, they will exceed WTO rules, or they will largely follow the WTO rules. And we'll see that they will deal with investment and also may cover government procurement. But we'll like to see a quite difficult situation, for example, in area like agriculture and service trade. For example, those involving the presence of natural persons. A second dimension we can understand those kind of free trade agreements is depth. So here I means regulatory density, how deep or how the trade agreements penetrate into domestic regulatory practice. So if we look at the deep free trade agreements, they have a deeper policy commitments, harmonizing domestic regulation of financial services, environmental standards, and so on and so forth. Here we could have two indicators. One is looking to regulatory cooperation and coherence. These are rules where they try to address or spillover effects of regulatory measures. They try to establish mutual recognition agreements. Actually, the regulatory cooperation and coherence is kind of the distinctive characteristics of the FTAs involving OECD countries like USMCA. And those kind of regulatory cooperation and coherence could have three types of rules. One is the regulatory coherence across regulatory regime. So for example, they may adopt good regulatory practices, in terms of how domestic process will be for adoption, enactment, and administration of regulatory measures. The second, so they may, for example, they may ask you to, like in TPP, that call for the measures to be plain written, clear, and so on and so forth. The second category of regulatory cooperation and coherence is the loose forms of regulatory cooperation. So they establish some procedural or institutional, framework, like in CETA, they are regulatory cooperation forum. The third types of rules in regulatory cooperation and coherence is the deep forms of regulatory cooperation. They try to substantially harmonize the standards, develop arrangements on mutual recognition. And so, for example, CETA has a protocol on mutual acceptance of the results of conformity assessment. Having said that, it's remained to be seen, Australia, India, whether they will incorporate their trade agreements, will incorporate all three of them. Because, for example, deep forms of regulatory cooperation may have higher requirements on both sides, in terms of their, kind of recognition of each other's standards. So it won't be easy. So we'll see whether they can deliver those kind of rules or not. And another indicator of depth is domestic law changes, which means institutional developments and a higher level of policy coordination. It could mean that the free trade agreements may require domestic administrative, regulatory, and legal reforms. And it's to be seen whether the India and Australia trade agreements will bring the need for domestic law changes. And the third dimension is the strength. So here means the strength is that the rule use intensity. To what extent the rules can be implemented through it either go to the binding dispute resolution process or by other ways, suspended obligation and so on and so forth. And here we could have two indicators. One is state to state. Here I focus more on state to state instead of investor state dispute settlement, because they are more likely to be the major focus of the India-Australia trade agreements. For state to state dispute settlements, one criteria is about their rules. So whether they will contain new or more detailed rules on panel proceedings. And the second indicator here for strength is their coverage of the state-to-state dispute resolution. Will that expand to beyond areas like commercial considerations in SOEs or government procurement, financial services, or labor and environmental issue, or even regulatory coherence issues. So those are the issues that we have to watch closely. And to conclude here, I would like to see that the framework I propose about breadth, depth, and strength, carrying with it the 6 indicators. So they could be breadth. For breadth, the indicators are WTO plus obligation and WTO beyond obligations. For depth, the indicators are regulatory cooperation and coherence and domestic law changes. And the third dimension for strengths, the indicators will be the dispute resolution rules and their coverage. And I would like to see that breadth and depth deals more about the landscape of a trade, while strengths decide how the rules will be followed. So they deal with some of them like coverage, breadth, depth. I think maybe it's more about the essence of these rules, how they affect regulation, and strength is more about implementation. And they may have some overlap, like breadth and depth are interrelated, and sometimes they could have broader outreach, also may demand more stringent regulatory mechanism. I think this mechanism will be useful to understand Australia-India free trade agreements, how they differ from other trade agreements, and also the implications of it, and how we understand their merits and effects. And it also could be useful for trade negotiation, including identifying possible best practice. And I would like to conclude here. Thank you.